Across remote valleys and mountain ridges, travelers vanish without sound. Campsites are torn apart, trees marked high above reach, and screams echo where no one should be. Locals speak of something watching, patient, deliberate, unseen, yet near. From the Cascade Wilderness in 2025 to the frozen Alps in 2020, each case deepens the mystery. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters that redefine fear in the wild. The Cascade Backcountry, nestled in the dense wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, had always been a place where civilization felt like a distant memory. The region stretched across thousands of acres of old-growth forest, punctuated by narrow logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Local historians noted that indigenous tribes had long avoided certain pockets of these woods, claiming the land belonged to something else entirely. By 2025, the area had become a haven for adventurous campers seeking solitude, though rangers quietly advised against venturing too deep after dark. On October 8, 2025, 4 friends arrived at a remote clearing roughly 18 miles from the nearest paved road. Evan Holbrook, a software engineer from Seattle, had organized the trip as a way to disconnect from the chaos of city life. His girlfriend, Lily Vance, taught elementary school and had been looking forward to the fall colors. Marcus Chen, Evan's college roommate, worked in finance and brought along his new girlfriend, Tessa Ruiz, a graphic designer who had never been camping this far from civilization. They parked their 32-foot RV beneath a cluster of towering Douglas firs, the vehicle's generator humming softly as they settled in for what they hoped would be a peaceful weekend. The first night passed without incident, though Marcus mentioned hearing something large moving through the underbrush around midnight. Evan dismissed it as a deer, or possibly an elk, reminding everyone that the forest was full of wildlife. They spent the following day hiking a nearby ridge, snapping photos of the autumn landscape, and joking about how disconnected they felt from their usual routines. By the time they returned to the RV that evening, the sun had already dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across their campsite. Around 8 in the evening, Lily commented that the forest had gone eerily quiet. The usual chorus of insects and birds had vanished, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Tessa suggested they head inside and start a movie, though nobody could quite shake the feeling that something had shifted in the atmosphere. They locked the RV's door and settled onto the built-in couches, trying to ignore the occasional creak of branches outside. Just before midnight, Marcus stepped outside to check on a strange smell he described as musky and overwhelming, like wet animal fur mixed with decay. He returned moments later, visibly shaken, reporting that he had seen what looked like massive handprints pressed into the dirt near the rear of the RV. The prints measured at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct finger-like impressions that bore no resemblance to bear tracks. Evan grabbed a flashlight and went out to investigate, but the beam only revealed more of the same prints circling their vehicle in a wide arc. They decided to leave at first light, unwilling to risk staying another night in a place that suddenly felt hostile. Evan tried starting the RV's engine, but the battery had mysteriously died despite having been fully charged earlier that day. Marcus suggested they hike out at dawn, but Lily pointed out that 18 miles through unfamiliar terrain in the dark would be suicide. They agreed to wait it out, keeping the doors locked and staying alert. Around 2 in the morning, a sound unlike anything they had ever heard shattered the silence. It started as a low, guttural grunt that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, followed by heavy footsteps that circled the RV with deliberate slowness. Tessa whispered that it sounded like something massive was pacing just beyond the windows, its breathing audible even through the insulated walls. Then came the first impact. The entire RV shuddered violently as something struck the driver's side with tremendous force, denting the metal and cracking one of the windows. Evan yelled for everyone to get down, but before they could react, a second blow rocked the vehicle so hard that it tilted onto 2 wheels before crashing back down. Lily screamed as the rear door was suddenly torn from its hinges, the metal shrieking as it was peeled away like aluminum foil. In the doorway stood a silhouette that defied comprehension, a massive, upright figure covered in dark fur, its shoulders nearly as wide as the doorframe itself. The next moments dissolved into chaos. The creature reached inside with arms that seemed impossibly long, grabbing Marcus and dragging him out into the darkness despite his desperate attempts to hold onto the doorframe. Tessa lunged forward to help, but was struck by a backhand swipe that sent her crashing into the kitchenette. Evan tried to shield Lily, but the RV was already being pushed sideways, the tires screeching as the vehicle slid across the dirt toward a large pine tree. The roof buckled inward with a deafening crunch as the creature climbed on top, its weight collapsing the aluminum frame. A neighboring camper, stationed nearly a mile away, later reported hearing a woman scream cut short around 2:15 in the morning, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal being torn apart. He assumed it was a bear attack and radioed for help at first light, though he admitted he was too frightened to investigate in the dark. When rangers arrived shortly after dawn on October 9th, they found the RV crushed against the base of a massive pine tree, its roof completely caved in, and the driver's side door missing entirely. The interior was destroyed, furniture overturned, walls gouged with deep scratches, and broken glass scattered across the blood-smeared floor. Muddy prints covered every surface, each one measuring over 18 inches in length with clear, finger-like impressions. The tracks outside showed signs of struggle, with dragged trails leading into the dense forest where they abruptly ended at a rocky outcrop. Despite an extensive search involving dogs and helicopters, no trace of Evan Holbrook, Lily Vance, Marcus Chen, or Tessa Ruiz was ever recovered. The official report classified the incident as a fatal animal attack, though investigators privately admitted they had never seen anything like the prints left behind. Local authorities quietly closed the area to camping, citing safety concerns, and residents of the nearest town began avoiding the backcountry roads altogether. The clearing where the RV was found remains abandoned, marked only by tire tracks and a lingering sense of dread that even experienced rangers refused to ignore. The Alder Creek Wilderness stretched across nearly 40,000 acres of untouched forest in the northern mountain range, a place where cell service disappeared within the first 5 miles, and the nearest town sat over 30 miles away. The region had earned a reputation among experienced backpackers as one of the most pristine and isolated areas in the country, with trails that wound through dense groves of alder and pine, following crystal-clear creeks that had carved their way through ancient rock over millennia. Park records showed that fewer than 200 people visited the backcountry section each year, most preferring the easier day hikes near the main entrance. Historical accounts from early trappers mentioned the area with a certain reluctance, noting that their trap lines near the upper creek consistently came back empty, as though something was deliberately avoiding or removing the bait. Hannah Lane arrived at the trailhead on the morning of June 14, 2022, her pack loaded with enough supplies for a week-long solo expedition. At 31 years old, Hannah had logged hundreds of miles in remote wilderness areas and considered herself more comfortable in the backcountry than in her apartment back in Portland. She signed the trail register, noting her planned route along the Upper Creek section, and set off into the forest with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The first 3 days passed without incident. Hannah made camp each evening near the creek, falling asleep to the sound of rushing water and waking to the calls of varied thrushes in the canopy above. On the afternoon of June 17th, she radioed the ranger station during her scheduled check-in, reporting that everything was proceeding smoothly and that she planned to reach the headwaters by the following evening. Her next transmission came at dusk that same day, but the tone had changed entirely. Hannah's voice came through shaky and broken, barely audible over the static. She reported seeing something huge standing in the middle of the creek, roughly 50 yards from her position. The ranger on duty, Thomas Kimball, asked her to describe what she was seeing, but Hannah seemed unable to form coherent words. She mentioned that it was upright, taller than any person, and that it had been watching her for several minutes without moving. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp, crackling sound, and all subsequent attempts to raise her on the radio went unanswered. Search and rescue teams mobilized at first light on June 18th, but the remote location meant it took nearly 6 hours to reach Hannah's last known coordinates. When they finally arrived at her campsite near the creek, they found her gear arranged in a bizarre tower beside the water. Tent poles, cooking equipment, and her backpack all stacked with an unnatural precision that nobody could explain. The arrangement stood nearly 6 feet tall, perfectly balanced despite the uneven shapes of the objects, and seemed to have been constructed with deliberate care rather than thrown together in panic. Nearby, smooth river stones had been balanced into narrow, tapering structures that pointed directly toward the dense tree line on the far bank. The search team waded into the creek and discovered enormous footprints pressed into the sandy bottom, each one measuring at least 17 inches in length with clearly defined toe impressions. The prints led upstream for nearly a quarter mile before disappearing entirely where the creek bed turned to solid rock. Despite expanding the search to cover a 5-mile radius, no trace of Hannah herself could be found. 23 hours after her last radio call, Hannah Lane stumbled into a ranger station 12 miles from her original campsite, appearing from the access road just after dawn on June 19th. She was barefoot, her pants soaked to mid-thigh, and she seemed unable or unwilling to explain where she had been or how she had covered so much ground. Her wristwatch had been shattered at some point, the hands frozen at exactly 1 hour after her final transmission. Medical staff noted she was dehydrated but otherwise physically unharmed, though she exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma. In the days that followed, Hannah provided only fragments of information to investigators. She mentioned waking in the darkness to see a tall figure standing motionless at the edge of her camp, its outline barely visible against the moonlit trees. She said it never moved or made a sound, simply watched her for what felt like hours. Hannah claimed she left her gear and fled the forest before sunrise, though she could not account for the missing time or how her equipment had been deliberately rearranged. She recalled running through the forest in complete darkness, branches tearing at her clothing and face, driven by a primal terror she couldn't articulate even weeks later. The creek section where Hannah had camped was temporarily closed to backpackers, though park officials cited trail maintenance rather than safety concerns. Rangers who visited the site in the following weeks reported an unusual silence in the area, as though wildlife was actively avoiding the location. Hannah Lane never returned to the wilderness and sold all her camping equipment within a month of the incident. The balanced stones remained undisturbed for weeks until high water finally swept them away. The Bitterwood Mountains rose sharply from the valley floor, their peaks perpetually crowned with snow even in late autumn. The remote range stretched across the northern border region, a place where settlements were sparse and the forest remained largely untouched by modern development. Local hunters had long valued the area for its abundant wildlife, particularly the population of black bears that denned in the higher elevations. The terrain was unforgiving, with steep ravines and dense thickets of lodgepole pine that could disorient even experienced outdoorsmen within minutes. On the morning of November 3, 2009, Colin Merrick and Javier Reyes set out from a forestry road at first light, their rifles slung over their shoulders and their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Both men were seasoned hunters who had been coming to the Bitterwood Range for over a decade, and they knew the mountain's moods better than most. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, leaving a pristine white blanket that would make tracking considerably easier. They hiked steadily upward through the silent forest, following a game trail that wound between massive boulders and ancient trees. By mid-morning, they picked up the tracks of a large black bear moving through a narrow valley. The prints were deep and widely spaced, suggesting an animal of significant size, possibly a mature male preparing for winter denning. Colin estimated they were no more than 2 hours behind their quarry, and the men increased their pace, eager to close the distance before the bear reached rougher terrain where following would become nearly impossible. The trail led them higher into the mountains, past tree line, and into exposed areas where the wind cut through their layered clothing. They followed the tracks through a series of switchbacks, the bear's path meandering but purposeful. Around 2 in the afternoon, as they crested a small ridge, both men stopped abruptly. The tracks continued down the slope ahead, but something had changed. The snow was disturbed in a wide circle, and a dark shape lay motionless in the clearing below. They approached cautiously, rifles ready, but quickly realized the bear was already dead. What they found defied every expectation they had brought with them that morning. The animal had been gutted and partially skinned with a precision that went far beyond what any predator could accomplish. The hide had been removed in clean sections, exposing the muscle beneath, and the internal organs had been extracted and set aside in an almost methodical arrangement. No scavenger worked this way, and the cuts were too deliberate to be accidental damage. Colin knelt beside the carcass, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, when Reyes grabbed his shoulder and pointed toward the tree line. A shadow shifted between the pines, large and upright, moving with a fluidity that seemed wrong for something of its apparent size. Then they saw it clearly. A massive figure crouched near a fallen log, its back to them, one long arm still working at the bear's hide with careful, measured movements. The creature's shoulders were impossibly broad, covered in dark fur that blended with the shadows, and its limbs seemed disproportionately long compared to its torso. For several seconds, neither man moved or breathed. Then, as if sensing their presence, the figure's head turned sharply in their direction. Even at a distance of 30 yards, both hunters could see that whatever was watching them bore no resemblance to any animal they had ever encountered. Its face was obscured by shadow and distance, but the posture, upright, alert, intelligent, sent a primal wave of fear through both men. The creature rose to its full height in a single smooth motion, easily clearing 7 feet, and then simply vanished into the forest with a speed that seemed physically impossible. One moment it was visible against the tree line, and the next it had melted into the shadows without so much as a broken branch or disturbed snow to mark its passage. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as though the entire mountain was holding its breath. Colin and Reyes stood frozen for what felt like minutes, but was likely only seconds. When they finally looked at each other, no words were necessary. They turned and began descending the mountain as quickly as the terrain would allow, neither man willing to spend another moment in that clearing. Behind them, the snow around the butchered bear was churned and packed with enormous footprints, each one measuring well over a foot in length. Deep gouges marked the bark of nearby trees at heights no bear could reach. The woods scored with what appeared to be claw marks. They reached their truck just before dark, neither having spoken more than a handful of words during the entire descent. The prize they had tracked all morning remained on the mountain, forgotten and irrelevant. Both men filed brief reports with the local wildlife office, though they kept the stranger details to themselves, knowing how the story would sound to anyone who hadn't been there. Colin Merrick sold his hunting rifles the following spring and never returned to the mountains. Reyes continued hunting for a few more years, but avoided the Bitterwood Range entirely, choosing valleys and forests where the trees felt less ancient and the silence less complete. The Fog Valley earned its name honestly, sitting in a natural basin where cool mountain air collided with warmer currents from below, creating dense banks of mist that could persist for days at a time. The area occupied a remote section of wilderness, roughly 40 miles from the nearest town, and was accessible only by a network of poorly maintained trails that saw perhaps a dozen hikers each summer season. Early settlers had avoided building in the valley despite its level terrain and water access, though local records offered no clear explanation for this reluctance. By 2014, the region had been incorporated into a larger wilderness preserve, with rangers occasionally patrolling the outer trails, but rarely venturing into the deeper sections. On August 22, 2014, Benjamin Voss and Nora Kellett set out to explore an old trail that wound through the heart of the Fog Valley. Ben, a 28-year-old photographer from Denver, had been drawn to the area by rumors of unique atmospheric conditions that created striking visual effects. Nora, his girlfriend of 2 years, taught biology at a community college and appreciated the opportunity to document plant species that thrived in the perpetually damp environment. They had permits for a 3-day trek and carried GPS units programmed with waypoints that would guide them back to their vehicle. The first day passed without incident, though both hikers noted that the fog seemed unusually thick, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in some sections. They made camp that evening near what their map indicated was a seasonal stream, though the ground was dry despite the moisture in the air. Ben mentioned feeling watched several times during the afternoon, but attributed the sensation to the disorienting effect of hiking through such limited visibility. Their GPS units both stopped transmitting shortly after dawn on August 23rd, though the devices themselves appeared to be functioning normally. Ben attempted to backtrack to their previous night's campsite to re-establish the signal, but the trail they had followed seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by dense underbrush that showed no signs of recent passage. They decided to push forward, reasoning that the trail must continue ahead and that they could always follow the ravine they had spotted on their map to reach a known landmark. When search teams reached the area 4 days later, they found the couple's tent slashed open from top to bottom, the fabric torn in long vertical strips that suggested deliberate action rather than weather damage. Their gear lay scattered across the campsite, sleeping bags unrolled and pulled apart, cooking equipment knocked over. But their food supplies remained completely untouched in the bear canister where they had been stored. The scene looked like the aftermath of a violent confrontation, yet there were no signs of blood or any obvious indication of what had occurred. The trees surrounding the campsite had been stripped of bark in vertical sections reaching approximately 10 feet high, exposing the pale wood beneath in uniform strips. Investigators initially suspected bear activity, but the pattern was too regular and extended far higher than even a large grizzly could reach while standing on its hind legs. More disturbing were the strange constructions hanging from branches throughout the area, bundles of reeds and tall grass woven into complex knots and suspended at heights that would require considerable effort to reach. The ground near the tent was marked with deep depressions that bore a passing resemblance to footprints, though the shapes were distorted and unclear. The impressions measured roughly 18 inches in length and appeared to have been made by something moving on 2 legs. The prints led toward a steep ravine at the edge of the clearing, then simply stopped at the precipice with no indication of how or where whatever had made them had continued. A park maintenance worker named Gerald Sims visited the site 3 days after the initial search concluded, tasked with removing the damaged tent and other equipment. He later filed a report describing unusual sounds he heard while working, muffled cries that seemed to echo from somewhere below the fog line in the ravine, as though someone was calling out from the depths of the valley. Sims admitted he saw nothing when he peered over the edge, and the sounds eventually faded. He left the site shortly afterward, without completing his assigned tasks. Geological surveys conducted in the following weeks found no evidence of recent soil collapse or rock slides that might have caused the hikers to fall into the ravine. The fog in the valley remained unusually persistent throughout the autumn months, with rangers noting that it seemed to gather with unnatural density in the specific area where the tent had been found. Benjamin Voss and Nora Kellett were officially listed as missing persons, with the case remaining open, despite the absence of any viable leads. Search efforts continued sporadically for 6 months before being suspended due to dangerous weather conditions and a lack of new evidence. Local residents began reporting strange experiences in the vicinity of the Fog Valley. Hikers mentioning the sensation of being followed, the sound of heavy breathing that seemed to come from just beyond visible range, and an overwhelming urge to leave the area as quickly as possible. The trail where Ben and Nora disappeared was removed from official park maps the following year, with the access points quietly blocked by fallen timber that rangers made no effort to clear. The Yenisei River stretched for thousands of miles through the Siberian wilderness, its tributaries branching into remote valleys where human presence had remained minimal for centuries. The particular stretch that Alexei Volkov and Yuri Petrov chose for their expedition flowed through dense taiga forest, miles from any settlements or established camps. Local guides typically avoided this section due to unpredictable currents and a lack of safe exit points. but both men had extensive rafting experience and felt confident in their abilities to navigate the challenging waters. On July 19, 2023, they launched their inflatable raft from a narrow put-in point where a logging road intersected the river. The current was strong from recent snowmelt in the mountains, and the banks rose steeply on both sides, thick with Siberian pine and birch. They planned to cover approximately 50 kilometers over 4 days, reaching a pickup point where a friend would meet them with transportation back to the nearest town. The first 2 days proceeded smoothly, despite the aggressive current and several technical rapids that required careful maneuvering. They made camp each evening on gravel bars, noting that the forest seemed unusually quiet after sunset. Yuri mentioned seeing what looked like large footprints in the mud near their second campsite, but Alexei dismissed them as bear tracks, reminding his friend that brown bears were common throughout the region. On the morning of July 22nd, a group of hikers following a trail that paralleled the river roughly 3 kilometers inland discovered a body half submerged in a shallow bend. The man was later identified as Alexei Volkov through documents found in a waterproof pouch still attached to his belt. His clothing had been shredded, torn into long strips that exposed deep lacerations across his torso and legs. The injuries were inconsistent with drowning or impact trauma from river obstacles, and medical examiners privately noted that the wound patterns resembled those made by large claws, though significantly more severe than typical bear attack. The muddy shoreline near where Alexei's body was found showed numerous massive footprints pressed deep into the soft ground. Each print measured approximately 19 inches in length, with clearly defined toe impressions that appeared almost human-like in their configuration. The prints circled the immediate area in a pattern that suggested prolonged activity, and drag marks led from the river's edge into the water, as though something had been pulled or carried. Search teams immediately began combing the river and surrounding forest for any sign of Yuri Petrov, deploying boats and aerial reconnaissance to cover the remote terrain. 7 days passed with no result, and authorities began preparing to classify him as presumed dead when he stumbled into a ranger outpost nearly 80 kilometers downstream from where his companion's body had been discovered. Yuri arrived at the station on the morning of July 29th, soaking wet despite the warm weather, his clothes torn and his face scratched by branches. He was severely dehydrated and appeared to be in shock, his eyes darting constantly around the small building as though expecting something to emerge from the surrounding forest. Medical personnel transported him to a regional hospital where he spent 3 days under observation, though he remained largely unresponsive to questions about what had happened. When he finally began speaking, Yuri's account was fragmented and difficult to follow. He repeated phrases about something huge in the forest, something that had been watching them from the trees during their final night on the river. He described waking to find Alexei missing from their camp and hearing sounds of struggle from the direction of the water. Yuri claimed he had tried to help, but something had grabbed him from behind, dragging him into the forest with strength that felt inhuman. He could not explain the week-long gap between the incident and his arrival at the ranger post, nor could he account for how he had covered such a considerable distance through terrain that should have taken days to traverse on foot. Rescue teams who returned to search the area where Alexei was found discovered the remains of their raft, tangled in fallen timber, nearly a kilometer downstream. The raft had been partially deflated, with long tears in the rubberized fabric that appeared to have been made by something sharp. Deep, irregular drag marks led from the river into the dense forest, the trail visible for approximately 50 meters before vanishing where the ground became too hard to hold impression. The stretch of river where the incident occurred gained a dark reputation among local guides and adventurers. Rafting groups began choosing alternative route, even if it meant adding days to their journeys. And hunters who once frequented the area reported an increasing reluctance to camp anywhere near the water. Several mentioned hearing sounds after dark, heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, branches breaking under significant weight, and occasional guttural calls that echoed across the valley. Yuri Petrov never returned to the river and left Siberia entirely within 2 months of the incident. He declined all requests for detailed interviews, and the official report listed the death of Alexei Volkov as resulting from an animal attack, though investigators privately acknowledged that the evidence suggested something far outside normal wildlife behavior. The ranger post where Yuri had emerged logged an unusual number of disturbance reports in the following year, with staff describing an unnatural silence that would descend on the forest without warning, lasting for hours before the normal sounds of birds and insects gradually resumed. The abandoned silver mine sat at an elevation of nearly 3,000 meters in the Swiss Alps, accessible only by a steep hiking trail that switched back through rocky terrain far above the nearest village. The mine had ceased operations in 1967 after a series of cave-ins made continued extraction economically unviable, and the entrance had been loosely sealed with timber and warning signs that had weathered to near illegibility over the decades. Local historians noted that the original miners had reported strange occurrences during the final years of operation: tools disappearing, unexplained sounds from unexplored tunnels, and several workers refusing to descend into the deeper shaft without a clear explanation. Village records from that period mentioned multiple instances of miners arriving at the surface hours late, claiming to have become disoriented in sections they had navigated countless times before. On September 11, 2020, Matthias Berger made the challenging climb to the mine entrance, carrying equipment for documenting abandoned industrial sites. At 43 years old, Matthias had spent years exploring forgotten structures throughout Europe, and the remote alpine mine represented exactly the sort of isolated location that fascinated him. He had obtained unofficial permission from a village elder, who warned him that the mine was unstable and that entering alone was inadvisable. But Matthias had extensive experience with such environments and felt confident in his ability to navigate safely. The elder had also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that local shepherds avoided bringing their flocks to the meadows near the mine entrance, claiming the animals became agitated and refused to graze there. The entrance tunnel extended roughly 30 meters before branching into multiple passages that descended deeper into the mountain. Matthias noted that the old timber supports were in surprisingly good condition despite the mine's age, though icy drafts swept through the corridors with enough force to make his headlamp flicker. The temperature dropped noticeably as he progressed, and a persistent smell, musky and organic, like wet fur mixed with decay, grew stronger the deeper he ventured. He followed the main shaft for approximately 15 minutes, documenting the rusted mining equipment and collapsed sections with his camera, pausing occasionally to steady himself as vertigo threatened to overwhelm his sense of direction. Around 2 in the afternoon, as he explored a side passage that angled sharply downward, Matthias became aware of a sound that didn't match the ambient drip of water or the creak of aging wood. It was a slow, rhythmic thumping, regular and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. The sound carried a physical quality, each beat vibrating through the stone beneath his feet in a way that suggested something substantial creating the noise. Between the thump, he thought he detected something else, a low, rasping breath that seemed to follow the same rhythm. Curiosity overrode caution, and Matthias followed the sound through a series of turns that took him into sections of the mine he suspected had not been accessed in decades. The walls here showed no signs of tool marks or deliberate excavation, as though these passages had formed naturally, and the miners had simply followed them deeper. The thumping grew steadily louder, the intervals between each beat remaining unnervingly consistent, and the rasping breath became unmistakable. Something alive was producing both sounds. After descending roughly 50 meters through increasingly narrow passages, he emerged into a small chamber where his headlamp beam revealed a scene that made no immediate sense. Dozens of animal carcasses lay scattered across the chamber floor: mountain goats, ibex, chamois, and several marmots, all in various stages of decay, but each one meticulously stripped of its hide. The work was far too precise to be the result of scavengers, with the flesh exposed in clean sections and the bones arranged in loose piles along the chamber walls. The stone surfaces around the carcasses bore deep scratches, claw-like marks that scored the rock in parallel lines extending from floor to ceiling. Some of the gouges penetrated nearly an inch into the solid stone, requiring force that seemed impossible for any known animal to generate. The thumping sound intensified abruptly, the vibration strong enough that small stones began falling from the ceiling. Matthias stepped backward, his headlamp sweeping across the chamber, and caught a glimpse of movement in the far corner, a hulking shadow that flitted across the wall with a speed that seemed physically impossible for something of its apparent size. The figure moved on two legs, its silhouette suggesting massive shoulders and arms that extended nearly to the ground. For a fraction of a second, his light caught what might have been eyes reflecting back at him. Not the typical green or yellow glow of animal eyes, but a dull reddish gleam that suggested intelligence and awareness. Matthias stumbled backward in shock, striking one of the timber supports with his shoulder. The impact produced a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber, and the thumping ceased instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the darkness, oppressive in a way that triggered every primitive survival instinct Matthias possessed. He could sense movement in the blackness beyond his headlamp's reach, something large repositioning itself, and the musky smell intensified until it was nearly overpowering. He turned and ran back through the passages, no longer concerned with documenting his route or preserving the equipment that banged against tunnel walls as he fled. The climb back to the surface took less than half the time his descent had required, driven by adrenaline and a terror he couldn't entirely rationalize. Behind him, he thought he heard heavy footsteps following at a distance, though they stopped whenever he paused to listen. He emerged from the mine entrance, gasping and disoriented, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the hiking poles he had left outside. The afternoon sun felt blinding after the subterranean darkness, and he stood at the entrance for several minutes, half expecting something to emerge behind him. Matthias made it approximately halfway down the mountain trail before collapsing from exhaustion and what medical personnel later identified as shock. A group of hikers found him sitting on a boulder, mud-streaked and trembling, staring back up at the mountain with an expression they described as haunted. They helped him descend to the village, where he spent the night under medical observation, waking repeatedly from nightmares about being pursued through narrow stone corridors. When questioned about what he had experienced, Matthias provided a detailed account of the chamber and its content. Still, he struggled to explain the figure he had glimpsed or the source of the rhythmic thumping. Mountain rescue personnel organized a team to investigate, partly to verify his claims and partly out of concern that he might have suffered a head injury that produced hallucinations. The rescue team entered the mine 2 days later and located the chamber Matthias had described. The animal carcasses were exactly as he had reported, skinned with unnatural precision and arranged throughout the small space. The claw marks on the walls and ceiling were photographed and measured. Several team members noted that the depth and pattern of the gouges suggested considerable force applied by something they could not identify. However, they found no sign of whatever might have created them, and the chamber showed no evidence of recent occupation. One team member reported seeing what appeared to be massive handprints pressed into patches of mineral residue on the chamber floor, but these were photographed and documented without official comment. The mine was officially sealed with concrete barriers within a week of the investigation, with village authorities citing structural instability and biohazard concerns. However, residents noted that workers completing the sealing seemed unusually eager to finish quickly, and that several refused to enter the tunnels at all, preferring to work only at the entrance. The construction foreman later mentioned that his crew had heard sounds from deep within the mine while working, distant thumping that seemed to answer the noise of their equipment. Matthias Berger left Switzerland shortly after the incident and ceased all exploration of abandoned sites. The carcasses remained in the chamber behind the newly installed barriers, slowly decomposing in the cold darkness, their presence unexplained and undisturbed, save for whatever continued to inhabit the deeper tunnels of the mountain. Local shepherds still avoid the high meadows near the mine, and hikers occasionally report hearing rhythmic sounds echoing from the sealed entrance when the wind blows from certain directions.